Today I'm going to be introducing to you Lydia Beida, who's a Montreal-based researcher and textile sustainability professional. She works as a programming coordinator at the Campaign for Wool Canada, an international nonprofit dedicated to public education on the benefits of natural fibers. She's also a part-time lecturer at the Toronto Metropolitan University, where she teaches a sustainability lab course in the undergraduate fashion program. Lydia has been an active volunteer at Fashion Revolution Canada as a policy lead for the past 2 years, co-developing the flagship No New Polyester campaign, and more recently supporting the redesign of the organization's most well-known research report, the annual Fashion Transparency Index. Lydia holds a master's degree in geography from the University of Toronto, and she's also a passionate knitter and an enthusiast of many crafts and DIYs. So today she's going to talk to us about unraveling fashion's dirty secrets with interdisciplinary thinking. Please join me in welcoming Lydia.
Hi everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Vanier College for this invitation, and specifically to Silke. I'm really happy to be here, and it's always a pleasure to speak about this topic to a wider audience, because I feel like fashion is still very much a siloed topic. To those of us who don't identify as being fashionable, or those of us who maybe don't shop a lot or don't care about brands and designers, we don't tend to think of ourselves as being part of a fashion system. But looking around the room, I see that everyone has clothes on, which is great news for all sorts of reasons. But I think one of the main points I want to make today is that just like with food or transportation, these industries that we know have such a big impact on the environment, clothing is very similar in this way. And the choices we make about what we wear have great effects on the lives of people who make them and, of course, the environment. So, a little bit about myself. My name is Lydia. I go by she, her. And I started my path in the fashion industry in a really mainstream way. I love clothes, so I went to a fashion program in CEGEP. And very quickly I started to become aware that sustainability, as much as it's such an overused word today, still seemed like this would be the big thing in the future. I was in CEGEP when the Paris Agreement was signed, so it seemed like this was the way to go, both in terms of the jobs I could have, but even just with my values, it's something I really cared about. So in university, I decided to take an environmental program at Concordia University, and just love it immediately. I love learning about science, research, ecology. I had courses just about anything Earth and environment related. And by the time I was almost done with my bachelor's degree, I realized that maybe now is the time to try to bridge those two things that brought me to the university in the first place. Connecting fashion and now environment, and see if I can do a project of my own. So I went to grad school in geography again. And the project that I wanted to do was to see, knowing that there's so many environmental problems with the industry, I wanted to find a case where there's more of a symbiosis between a community, a culture, and the environment that they live in. So I ended up in the Peruvian Amazon, working with with an indigenous group called Shipibo Kunipo, who are very famous for their textile culture. Their visual embroidery and textile dyeing technique called kene is actually a non-tangible patrimony of Peru, so it's very widely recognized. And it's very complementary with conservation efforts, because the materials that these artisans use are honestly very sustainable and promote local biodiversity. And after my fieldwork was done, I went on a little trip up in the Andes in Peru and encountered the sheep and alpaca cultures in the Andes. And was at home working on my thesis, and I really needed a tangible outlet for all the stress of writing a very long thesis. So by the time I was done with my degree, I was also a pretty skilled knitter. And I thought, well, how can I, maybe this is the next thing for me, and animals and crafts. And that's what brought me to my current job and the campaign for wool. So right now I kind of juggle three main things. I work as, Silke kindly introduced me at the beginning, program coordinator at an organization called Campaign for Wool. And we work on reviving Canadian wool industry that used to be actually quite big. And we conduct and communicate research to the public about the environmental impact of different fibers. I'm also a volunteer policy lead at Fashion Revolution Canada. I'll speak about the organization quite a bit in my presentation today. And I'm also a part-time university instructor at a fashion department in Toronto. So to start us off, I have a tiny exercise for everybody. I hope you don't mind participating. It just consists of looking at what you're wearing today and checking your garment label to see what is actually the fiber composition of the piece you're wearing today. Okay. You can also take a note of where it's made and what country. And if you can just take a mental note on how long you also had this garment for. And if you can just hold on to that information for the next little while, we're gonna come back to it, okay? Now, I just told you that I have a degree in geography, so it's only natural that I start the presentation with a satellite image. Does anyone have any guess at what this might be? You can just speak up if you like, or raise your hand. Anybody? Please don't leave me hanging.
Like dirty water.
Dirty water, okay, that's a good guess.
Is it like sand fields or something?
Sand fields? Okay, that's what you would expect it to be, right? It's like we're in a mountain somewhere. But unfortunately, this is a clothing dump in the Atacama Desert in Chile. It can now be seen from space. And each year, around 40,000 tons of clothing gets dumped on the site, coming from everywhere in the world, especially African countries, including us in Canada. Now, let's come back to the first question that I just asked you a while ago. How long have you had the garment that you have on today? And most importantly, how long do you think you're going to hold on to it before you donate it or chuck it in the garbage bin? Yeah, some of the questions to consider. So the average person in a global north country today buys 60% more clothing items that they did 15 years ago and keep them for just half as long. And the average garment before it's thrown away is worn on average 10 times or less. So that's pretty chilling statistic, and I think the clothing industry is a perfect poster child for capitalism because it's really fueled by consumption. I shop, therefore I am, right? It's this idea, and the idea of clothing representing our places in a society is not new, right? This is something that's been around for as long as human cultures. But this new system, and especially powered by social media, outfit of the day, the frequency at which you have to showcase yourself to the world wearing new clothes, I think this is something that may be driving this. So where do we begin the journey of actually understanding the impact of our clothing on our planet? So I have a short video for you that we show to the fashion students in the course that I teach. And I think it will do a good job at explaining to you the context of what I mean. So bear with me with this YouTube video, and here it comes.
Consider the classic white t-shirt. Annually, we sell and buy 2 billion t-shirts globally, making it one of the most common garments in the world. But how and where is the average t-shirt made, and what's its environmental impact? Clothing items can vary a lot, but a typical t-shirt begins its life on a farm in America, China, or India, where cotton seeds are sown, irrigated, and grown for the fluffy bolls they produce. Self-driving machines carefully harvest these puffs. An industrial cotton gin mechanically separates the fluffy bolls from the seeds, and the cotton lint is pressed into 225 kilogram bales. The cotton plants require a huge quantity of water and pesticides. 2,700 liters of water are needed to produce the average t-shirt, enough to fill more than 30 bathtubs. Meanwhile, cotton uses more insecticides and pesticides than any other crop in the world. These pollutants can be carcinogenic, harm the health of field workers, and damage surrounding ecosystems. Some t-shirts are made of organic cotton, grown without pesticides and insecticides, but organic cotton makes up less than 1% of the 22.7 million metric tons of cotton produced worldwide. Once the cotton bales leave the farm, textile mills ship them to a spinning facility, usually in China or India, where high-tech machines blend, card, comb, pull, stretch, and finally twist the cotton into snowy ropes of yarn called slivers. Then yarns are sent to the mill, where huge circular knitting machines weave them into sheets of rough grayish fabric, treated with heat and chemicals until they turn soft and white. Here, the fabric is dipped into commercial bleaches and azo dyes, which make up the vivid coloring in about 70% of textiles. Unfortunately, some of these contain cancer-causing cadmium, lead, chromium, and mercury. Other harmful compounds and chemicals can cause widespread contamination when released as toxic wastewater in rivers and oceans. Technologies are now so advanced in some countries that the entire process of growing and producing fabric barely touches a human hand, but only up until this point. After the finished cloth travels to factories, often in Bangladesh, China, India, or Turkey, human labor is still required to stitch them up into t-shirts. Intricate work that machines just can't do. This process has its own problems. Bangladesh, for example, which has surpassed China as the world's biggest exporter of cotton t-shirts, employs 4.5 million people in the t-shirt industry, but they typically face poor conditions and low wages. After manufacture, all those t-shirts travel by ship, train, and truck to be sold in high-income countries, a process that gives cotton an enormous carbon footprint. Some countries produce their own clothing domestically, which cuts out this polluting stage. But generally, apparel production accounts for 10% of global carbon emissions. And it's escalating. Cheaper garments and the public's willingness to buy boosted global production from 1994 to 2014 by 400% to around 80 billion garments each year. Finally, in a consumer's home, the t-shirt goes through one of the most resource-intensive phases of its lifetime. In America, for instance, the average household does nearly 400 loads of laundry per year, each using about 40 gallons of water. Washing machines and dryers both use energy, with dryers requiring 5 to 6 times more than washers. This dramatic shift in clothing consumption over the last 20 years, driven by large corporations and the trend of fast fashion, has cost the environment, the health of farmers, and driven questionable human labor practices. It's also turned fashion into the second largest polluter in the world after oil. But there are things...
Okay, we'll talk about the things that we can do a bit later. Thanks for watching, and now back to my slides. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that when the price of clothing is too cheap, it is likely that someone else is paying the price, either the communities who produce the clothes or the ecosystems or both. Thousands of garment workers have paid the ultimate price of their life to produce our clothes. In April of 2013, in Dhaka, Bangladesh, in the biggest garment factory disaster until today in Rana Plaza, which you might have heard about. It was a completely preventable disaster, but the factory owners, whose clients include some of the household names that we're all familiar with, such as Joe Fresh and Walmart, ignored the signs of the building that was illegally expanded, that was cracking and about to collapse under its own weight. Fashion Revolution, the organization that I volunteer with, that I represent today, was founded a year later by two UK-based activists as a response to the Rana Plaza disaster and calling on brands to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Ursula de Castro, one of the co-founders of this activist movement, is famous for this quote. It isn't enough to just look for quality of the product that we buy, but we also must ensure that there is quality of lives to the people who make our clothes. Who Made My Clothes is a really famous campaign run by Fashion Revolution every year, which you might have seen on social media before. It calls upon brands and consumers to be transparent, right, about where clothes are produced, and call for more action to prevent accidents and, of course, death in the clothing production industry. And each April, Fashion Revolution Week commemorates this tragedy and amplifies this campaign. So let's come back to the second question that I asked you a while ago about where the garment you're wearing today is made. Does anybody want to tell us what their care label said? Please. Yeah. Bangladesh. Okay. Anyone else had that? Maybe different. Silky?
China.
China. Yeah. Vietnam. Okay. So there's a reason for that, right? After the free trade agreements were signed by many countries in the 1980s, 1990s, the clothing manufacturers in countries like Canada, United States, United Kingdom have packed up their industry at home and left in the search of cheaper labor and looser environmental regulations in countries like China and more recently Bangladesh and the neighboring South and Southeast Asian countries. And instead of creating high quality, dignified jobs in these countries that are actually really known for exquisite textile traditions, embroidery, leatherwork. I mean, you can see these ladies wearing their beautiful saris. They're not wearing Zara or H&M. No thanks, they don't need that, right? They have amazing textile traditions at home. These Western companies are turning global South countries into hellscapes, not bringing high quality jobs and also destroying local environments. And another jolly fact for you, before my family moved to Montreal, I grew up in Ukraine. And it's a country known for a pretty toxic site that you've, I'm sure, all heard about, the Chernobyl nuclear plant that had a biggest nuclear disaster in the history in the 1986. And I grew up in a coal mining region that also had terrible air quality. But I never thought that a site responsible for a garment industry could make it as high in the ranking of toxic places, most toxic places on Earth. So not too far from my home country, you have Hazaribagh, which is also the capital of Bangladesh, in Dhaka. I'll spare you the watching another video on this place, but it's not for the faint-hearted. And the toxic tanneries that are producing cheap leather bags and shoes for, again, fast fashion brands that we're all familiar with, have heavily polluted the waterways in Bangladesh with cadmium and other chemicals that are necessary to produce leather. Yeah. So as I said, lack of transparency really costs lives. And transparency, of course, is not the only solution by any means, but it's a necessary first step. And for this reason, for the past 9 years, Fashion Revolution has been publishing its flagship research report called Fashion Transparency Index. And it essentially ranks 250 biggest fashion brands according to their revenue, on where they stand on their social and environmental policies, their impacts, and their operations in their supply chains. So unfortunately, since the Rana Plaza disaster in 2013, the situation, as you can imagine, is still very far from perfect, and the progress has been slow across the board. In the 2023 report, only 2 out of 250 brands have shared their commitment to degrowth, or in other words, volume reduction. And only few major brands have published their commitments to zero deforestation. Right now, as you know, there's a biodiversity convention happening in Colombia, COP16. Colombia has a part of the Amazon rainforest, which is being deforested by and large also by cattle industry that supplies leather for the fashion industry. So, and it's worth noting that only 2 brands in last year's report scored higher than 80% overall. And the vast majority of brands have made very, very incremental progress, but they don't shy away from greenwashing us on their incremental change year to year. This year's Fashion Transparency Index has a special topic called What Fuels Fashion. And it specifically focuses on the climate or carbon footprint of the industry. So it's interesting to note that most of the impact of our clothing production originates from what we call Scope 3, or in simple terms, the life cycle of the garment from where the raw material comes from it. So be it fields where cotton is grown, be it pastures where sheep or alpacas are grazing, or more often than not, the oil fields where the oil is being pumped out of our planet's core to be transformed into synthetic products such as polyester, nylon, and all those fibers. And another really energy-intensive stage of the production is when the fibers are being spun into yarn to then be transformed into textile. A lot of these facilities are also in the global south, where there's very little renewable energy available, so all these plants are still very often powered by fossil fuels, so oil and gas and coal. So infuriatingly, fashion executives are still more incentivized by profits than by their decarbonization levels. Meanwhile, major garment-producing countries like Bangladesh, that we've already mentioned a few times, is already one of the most vulnerable countries to the effects of climate change. Meanwhile, we're being, of course, greenwashed that sustainable materials, next gen, such as plastic bottles being recycled into polyester, are going to somehow improve the situation, which I personally am very skeptical about. So this simple but kind of starking graph here shows that the global fiber production, so the raw materials that are needed to produce clothing, so cotton, wool, or polyester, have grown since 1995 and actually have no sign of slowing down. So if you were born in the 1990s or 2000s, there's twice as much fiber being produced today than when we were born, twice as much. And this is not cumulative, this is per year. So we're churning out that much fiber out into the world every year. So next year, 2025, we're projected to produce 16.5 kilograms of textile per person on the planet. How does that sound to you? Well, of course, it's not equally distributed, right? So consumers in the global north definitely consume or buy more textile products than people in the global south. So, last question that I had for you earlier on was, what is the fiber content of the garment that you're wearing today? And as it should be becoming clear to you, it really determines ultimately what impact it has on the environment. So does anyone wants to tell us what kind of fiber they're wearing today? Please, yeah. Cotton? Okay. 100%. 99 with a bit of elastane or something?
Yes.
Yeah. Typical, please.
It's 100% cotton.
Okay. Yeah.
100% cotton too.
Okay. A lot of I see a lot of hoodies, which maybe explains why there's so much cotton. But so maybe in this case, it will be somehow surprising to you that 67% of all clothing produced are actually synthetics. So they're made out of fossil fuels, oil, in other words. And what are the synthetics? Well, polyester is by far the most popular. Nylon is the one that we often see in active wear or socks. It's the one that's really stretchy. And all other fibers take up the remainder of the fiber breakdown. Cotton, of course, being second most popular fiber type, and wool, the fiber that's of big interest to me these days, is only 1% of the entire fiber production in the world. So if clothes make the man, then we're definitely becoming plastic people. Why? Because microplastics. Every time you wash your clothes, if it has any synthetics in it, hundreds of thousands of small particles are being released in the waterways, and they don't biodegrade. Peer-reviewed studies in medicine, toxicology are only catching up now to the scope of this problem, but in what we know already is that microplastics have been found in most human tissues, and what exactly does that mean for our health? We are yet to find out, because it's a relatively new problem that surely future generations will have to deal with even more than us. But the emerging research is showing that microplastics also shed a lot of toxic chemicals that are in them, which have development effects on children. It has effects on our hormone system, and the ability of our cells to regenerate. So at Fashion Revolution Canada, we also grapple with the fact that Canada is still one of the largest oil-producing countries in the world. So this year we launched our flagship campaign calling for consumers to check their labels and commit to buying no more polyester, and especially no new virgin synthetics for their wardrobe. As I told you earlier, I work in the wool industry, and there's a similar campaign running right now. October is actually the International Wool Month, and the message of this year's Wool Month is check its wool. So it has a similar kind of call to action to check your garment label and encourage people to choose natural materials. And there are reasons to do so. Wool in particular is similar to other natural materials, so animal fibers, but also plant fibers like cotton or linen, biodegrade in both soil and water. Wool, as I told you earlier, represents only 1% of the global fiber production. And not only that, but it's also 300 times more likely to be resold in a second-hand market. So it's unlike the synthetics that are very short-lived in our wardrobes, but very long-lived in the environment. Natural materials are actually the complete opposite. They're very desirable. We want to hold on to them more, especially animal materials tend to have really good longevity, but they easily return back to the soil when we no longer want them. So today we talked about different factors that contribute to the footprint of the clothing and the choices that our consumption has on the environment and also on the lives of people who produce our clothes. Where, by whom, and out of what our clothing is made are the questions that we should ask ourselves every time we choose to bring a new piece into our wardrobe. When we think about, of course, self-expression and joy that clothing brings us, we should also think about its wider impact. So if you ask me what are the alternatives, right? What can we do about it? And of course, our personal choices that I've already mentioned a few times are important, but collective action is ultimately necessary, right? As with many environmental problems, it's not something that we just can solve, with voting with a dollar or tweaking our personal habits, right? There's some good or some encouraging news on the horizon in other countries that will definitely have rippling effects here at home in Canada because it's such a global industry. For example, in the European Union, there's a new pilot project that's called Product Environmental Footprint, and it's essentially kind of a garment passport that will have a ranking, kind of an environmental score on every item that will be sold in stores. So it will tell consumers what is its recyclability or repairability potential, what was the carbon footprint based on the fiber type of the garment, and so on. In California, there's another very interesting legislation to look out for that's already passed into law. That's called extended producer responsibility. And it's essentially making the companies who produce clothing pay for the waste that they create. So right now, basically, the fashion brands don't have to pay for the waste management that their cities are left with after people toss away their clothes. But it's about to change in some states, and hopefully many other countries, including us, will follow through. So when we hear a lot around environmental problems, especially, is that the system is broken, we need to fix the system. But I would actually argue that the capitalist fashion system, as it is today, is actually working perfectly well because it's working as it's intended. And to quote Daniela Meadows, who wrote this really great book that I highly recommend called Thinking in Systems, the system causes its own behavior. So the current fashion system, the garment system, is really deadly to our planet and to people who make our clothes and now to us who wear the clothes because of microplastics and toxic fashion. So what kind of system can we create instead? If we are to mend literally and figuratively the relationship that we have with our clothing, personal actions do mean a lot still, and they add up. So taking care of our clothes, what we already have, repairing and appreciating them is actually a really radical act in today's world where we're just trained to replace, toss, and kind of forget about our clothing. And it's kind of like a slogan that we have at Fashion Revolution too, that mending is a radical act. But equally, imagining and testing different systems of garment production is also really inspiring. It's a great way to build and rebuild our communities. The world is really globalized, and as you saw in your care labels, most of the clothes, probably in the 90% of everything we wear is produced on other continents, and I don't think we can fully reverse it, nor we should, maybe to revert back to nationalist systems and close ourselves to the world. But there is a balance to be had. And one of such interesting projects is called Fiber Shed, and I would encourage you to look it up if you're interested. But it's this idea of, if we can fully dress ourselves with what's available in our bioregion. It started in Northern California, and there are now different fiber sheds across the world. And it's kind of starts with the idea of researching or, learning about what is grown in your region and what is accessible. So for us in Canada, linen is a really big one. Quebec used to be a historically very big linen producing region. And so is wool and alpaca and a few other animal fibers. You might also be pleased to know that there's some government grants currently being given out to this effort of reintroducing textile industry in Quebec and across Canada. For example, last December there was the first international wool conference that was held in Montreal for the first time in Canada. And the federal government has actually given funding through agri-food program also to the wool and animal fiber industry to make that link that clothing fiber is actually an agricultural product just like food. So we don't only grow food, but we also grow fiber to dress ourselves. Yeah. And I would like to leave you with just some recommendations, a couple of books that I like. Podcast, I don't know if anyone's into podcasts, this sounds really excellent. The name, it sounds really depressing, The Wardrobe Crisis, but I promise you it's actually really great. It's really fun. And if you would like to get more involved with Fashion Revolution, it's largely a student-led movement, it's always been. And we have student teams in many different CEGEPs and universities across Canada. And we're always looking for more volunteers. So you can find more details on our socials, and you're welcome to reach out to Fashion Revolution or to myself. I left my email if anyone has any follow-up questions. I'd be happy to connect with you. And yeah, I think this leaves us quite a bit of time for questions. I would love to get a chance to interact with you if anyone has anything to add. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a microphone I can bring around if any of you have questions for Lydia.
Hi, so, well, thank you for that, first off. And seeing as though I'm someone who's also interested in fashion, and it seems that, like, obviously this is, like, how your career started as well, I just was curious about your thoughts on the fashion industry more in a general sense. When we're talking about, like, New York Fashion Week, Seoul Fashion Week, because those are really, really, like, big polluting one-time, just for show type of things. And I just was curious. It wasn't really something that was touched upon, but I just wanted to know your thoughts.
The fashion cycle, I guess is the question. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, for sure. Just the fashion cycle in itself, you rightfully mentioned, is a big problem. So for context, each year is divided into two big seasons, right? Spring, summer, and fall, winter. And there are many even smaller seasons in between. So in the traditional fashion industry, especially, it's still true for designers, but for for more mass-produced brands as well, is that every half a year you're essentially producing brand new collection, right? And it's this novelty, and right, all the brands are expected to put out something new by a certain day. Every year. So it's a huge problem, of course. Now, since a couple of decades, right, we hear that fast fashion kind of like put that all to dust, and brands that we probably know, most of you, including myself, now shop at the H&Ms and the Uniqlos, and they don't even operate in such way anymore. They're able to produce a new collection, something crazy like every 2 weeks. And some of these ultra fast fashion brands, even faster. I don't even know how that is humanly feasible, but clearly it is. So volumes and speed are definitely two overlapping and biggest problems. Yeah.
So I had a little question, because a lot of us probably have too many clothes at home. And what is the best way to dispose of them so they don't just end up in landfill or in these dumps, like in the picture? Is there a better way to donate or work through it? Yeah.
Well, that's the $1 million question, Saki. The truth is, there is actually very few good ways to safely dispose your clothes, and there are multiple reasons for that. First is that we actually don't have a lot of recycling capacity. Like if somehow city of Montreal collected garments as like plastic bottles, that would be great, but we actually have very few ways to physically recycle fibers and to give them new life. there's very, very little of that on very kind of startup level, which hopefully will change in the future, but we're nowhere to be able to process the amount of clothes that we dispose, like even on the city level. When you see, it's becoming very common to see recycled polyester or recycled cotton on labels as a way to kind of, let you know that this is a more sustainable product. What you need to know, especially with recycled polyester, is that these are not recycled polyester garments. It's not, a pair of leggings that used to be a jacket 2 years ago. These are plastic bottles, so they're waste from the food industry. So it's not really a circular system because it relies on the availability of plastic bottles in the first place, which you can imagine that actually prevents plastic bottle and bottled water industry to eliminate a waste, like on their end. And to create a recycled polyester fabric, you always also need to add a little bit of new fabric to make it stick together, because if you can't just make a pair of stretchy leggings out of plastic bottle, you still need to add stuff to it. And it's been shown, there's a little bit of research that shows actually that recycled polyester garments shed even more microplastics than a virgin polyester garment. And then you also have a lot of blends. So a lot of folks said that they actually have 100% cotton garments. It's obviously still a really popular fiber content. Even in a 100% cotton garment, you will always have threads, right, that you are used to stitch a garment together. Those are very rarely cotton. They're usually polyester because it's stronger. So you can't really compost. To recycle, you have to recycle that garment, in theory, you have to also rip away the polyester, the zippers, the buttons, the polyester threads. So all of these things make it really difficult to recycle garments. Donations, as we saw with the satellite image very early on, are also problematic because we just have so much stuff that our local charity shops just can't absorb the amount of stuff that we donate. So a lot of it actually ends up abroad. It's unsold, and I don't think people in Chile or Ghana actually also need that much stuff that we send them, right? It's a whole topic that we could talk about for another hour. So it really starts, to think about what to do with my old stuff. It starts with maybe thinking of not buying in the first place, really reducing the amount of stuff we introduce into our wardrobes in the first place, extending the life of what we have. And there, of course, donation centers like Renaissance, Beida, I still think it's a great way to dispose of clothes, to keep it short, but to a certain extent, right? Yeah.
Other questions?
What is, to you, the most shocking thing you learned about the fashion industry? That, for example, if we want to encourage somebody to change their habits, what could we say to them to mark them? Because usually they don't really care unless they hear something shocking that will make them change their habits, basically.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think people tend to care and react a lot when it's something that touches them directly. And I would really recommend to check out this book because it's exactly what it is. It's kind of like an investigative journalism work that this author turned into a book. And it talks about specifically dyes and all the finishes that are found on clothing. And she started with a class action of a union of flight attendants in the United States that had their uniforms replaced, and many employees started to have very, very severe allergic reactions to the point that they gained a disability and had to retire early and their lives were destroyed. And it went on this long study to figure out, could it have been uniforms, because some people suspected it. And then it just opens up into this evidence that dyes, especially in synthetic clothing, but really on any type, like even cotton and stuff, are very toxic. It's the popular dyes that are called azo or dispersed dyes. They're very, very harmful, and they penetrate into everything, and especially if it's like something you work out and you sweat, can get into your skin. You're coming into contact with your clothing all the time, and when you inhale these fibers, the impact is just like staggering. So I think just showing that this is not just like clothing dump on another continent or poor garment workers. I mean, maybe it sounds cynical, but we see that clearly it has not solved the problem yet. So perhaps this is another way to approach some people who feel like, again, they're not kind of part of the system, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I had a question in regard to, let's say, what kind of materials other than obviously cotton and linen we would look for that would technically not be toxic and we can use and look into.
Yeah, definitely natural materials are a good place to start for various reasons. Well, first of all, right away the microplastic problem falls off if you're wearing and washing natural fibers. If you're buying secondhand, you're minimizing the risk to yourself significantly, because the longer the clothes have been in use, especially synthetics, some of those dyes and the fresh, anti-wrinkle, anti-stain things would have washed away. Like some of the off-gassing had, been done. So that's, one of the reasons maybe to check out secondhand shops. There's some really good certifications. Of course, when you start to get into, certified stuff, the price point is higher. I'm, being aware and speaking to students, and the budget, of course, is it's an important factor. Right? I mean, I've been there myself really not too long ago. But it's not always the case that if you're paying more money that it's necessarily good, but it is definitely a factor. So if you're able to encourage someone maybe smaller, someone who can give you that transparency and answer your questions, right? Either upfront by showing you, hey, I have this certification, which means, that it's been dyed with safe dyes, or it's been produced with natural materials, organically grown materials. That's something interesting, and I would encourage you to ask those questions. Right? I mean, if you write to Uniqlo, I don't think you'll hear back from them. But if you start these conversations with a local designer, I think they'll be really happy to also, take your questions and maybe go on this journey with you as well.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I was wondering, you touched upon a bit traditional textiles, in Peru. I was wondering if there's evidence that with mass production, traditional ways and traditional textiles, they die off or they fade away.
Yes, that's the short of it. It's the two go really hand in hand. So for really traditional textiles, I could just go back to the example of my field work. The artisans that I work with, I could just go back to the photo. They really target the tourism industry because there's quite a bit of ecotourism in that region. So they market those clothes kind of as a handicrafts that tourists can bring home. But they also had some collaborations with Peruvian designers, even some international designers. Again, in the price points, right, that acknowledge the work that's being put into it. But even just anecdotally, a lot of them are replacing natural dyes with commercial dyes because it's cheaper for them, it's less labor intensive. So there's kind of a temptation on their side to also kind of cut corners, if I can say, right? Not for all of the women, but certainly for some of them. And I can't be really the one to judge because these women also have families to take care of, and this is a very important source of income for them. So that's one side, right? So this kind of availability of these really crazy and cheap materials have definitely made their way down to artisans, right, who actually still hold this incredible knowledge. And yeah, to give you context, so this brown color you can obtain from a tree, a mahogany tree. Maybe some of you know, especially if you play musical instruments. Like it's a popular wood for like violins and guitars. But if you just take off a bit of bark and you boil it, you obtain this really nice tannin-rich kind of brick orange. So that's a traditional dye of the Peruvian Amazon. And I was fascinated with this connection that it's a tree that's now threatened to extinction in the wild. It's grown in plantations now to supply like the luxury wood industry. But there's still artisans who like have it in their backyards. And there's an interesting relation actually that they plant these trees and it's kind of like their savings account because they know that this wood is so expensive and it's worth so much. They're able to harvest bark for their textiles while the tree is growing and maturing because it kind of closes off and doesn't damage the tree if you do it carefully. And then that's like your children's like tuition money in 20 years because if you cut it down and you sell it, it's like a good cash for these people. And then closer to home, well, the wool industry, right? It's like now to make something out of Canadian wool, you will really have to scratch your head and go around and see who can make it for you. We still have sheep for the meat industry, but wool, really heartbreakingly, something like 90% of it is rotting away and doesn't have the market because we've lost the infrastructure. We don't have places that can wash it and spin it into yarn. There's some places across the country, it's really living like a renaissance right now, but it's such a broken supply chain. It's something crazy, like it's cheaper and more carbon efficient to ship our wool to China to be processed and brought back in fully finished garments, which to me sounds really crazy.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So thank you for coming, and it was a wonderful presentation. From my understanding, it seems like fast fashion seems to be more of a social problem in terms of the fabric, the tissues, what they put together that is done cheaply, and also too, it's cost effective, and basically the idea that we're living in a society where it's consumer consumption. But would you say when it comes to higher fashion, where you have to pay the money for the fabric, for the clothing, they're using much better material. So this is why it's not always affordable in one aspect, and it's easier to buy fast fashion, but it's also, how can I say, more detrimental to our health because of the materials that they're using. Am I getting this right? And another comment I have as well, with regards to natural fibers, I think it's a wonderful thing, but also sometimes people have allergic reactions to such natural fibers, and perhaps that's why also the market is not picking itself up.
Mm-hmm.
Just being in fashion all my life, I mean, I know a little bit about just a comment. Thank you.
Okay, so to your first point, I generally agree with you in terms of, I think I spoke about it a bit earlier, that it's generally the case that if you're paying more or if it's, a designer garment or, from a kind of like a higher quality brand that you're getting better quality, but it's not always the case. And I'm sure most of you have seen plenty of examples, especially, brands will really go after the logo, and they churn out crazy amount of volumes, even though it's so expensive, made with really cheap materials, synthetics, don't have design longevity, right? These are very pricey clothes, like sometimes going to thousands of bucks, that aren't necessarily something you'll want to keep for a long time, so they actually end up in the same place. I mean, even on the resale market, some of the designer things probably lose their value way faster than others, like really timeless design. And I'm not saying sure wear like wool blazers and like all look the same, and because it's timeless, of course, we all have different stuff, but it's like something to consider, but not like only to a certain extent. A lot of big like European brands still produce in Global South, still are caught violating human rights, not following up on their environmental due diligence. In the Fashion Transparency Index, you have all the big luxury brands as well, and they generally perform definitely better than fast fashion, that's for sure, like on average. Not too far from like brands who focus on sportswear like Adidas, Puma. Puma, I think, was the one actually that did the best in the last year's index. So, like, yes and no. And then for second point around allergies, I agree with you. There's definitely a misconception. I would say it's a misconception around natural materials. First of all, cotton, I don't really think people can be allergic to cotton. Wool suffers from this stereotype that it's an allergen. It's actually hyperallergenic. But of course, I'm aware that a lot of people have like just sensitivity to how itchy it can be, which is just as bad as an allergy you can have. That's for sure a barrier, maybe why it hasn't picked up, especially Canadian wool, because we don't have like fine wools like merino that's mostly grown in the southern hemisphere. But I think when you weigh the dangers of synthetics to your health and to the environment with an itchy sweater, I mean, to me maybe one kind of like is more important than the other, but I completely agree with you that, yeah, it's something to consider.
Anyone else?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I just thought that was so great and so clear. I have a lot of things swirling around in my mind. One is like, I would just love to see you up there giving this presentation alongside of someone who then takes, you go back and forth with someone from the food industry talking about, the sort of parallels and how this all interweaves. I don't know that I have so much a question as remarks. And as you were talking, I was thinking about that point, and I know someone asked a question around that, is this issue of sickness and illnesses. And it is really, truly remarkable how our health has been seemingly suffering more and more. I can't get over the number of, sadly, so many people I know that are, developing cancers, and it's really quite alarming. So again, I don't know that I have a question. I'm so appreciative that you brought this to us. That that we have you with us to kind of make comments about this, and yeah, I guess that's all I kind of really wanted to say. With the except there was one question I wrote down at one point in relation to animal welfare.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can speak to that in relation to thinking about, if we turn our sights more towards natural fibers and animal fibers, can you speak to the issue of animal welfare in the context of all of this?
For sure. I'm so happy this came up. It's such an important question. And I'm going to bring up this graph again with the fiber breakdown. But, when we're talking about changing the system, I think what really people mean is that we need to get rid of this chunk of synthetics, right? It's not about replacing it with wool and cotton. It's really about shrinking the whole bar way, way down. Because exactly for issues like that, I mean, we can't just suddenly have 15 times more sheep in the world to sustain this level of consumption. It's not going to work for the animals, for overgrazing, for methane, like all sorts of reasons. I mean, animal fiber production is very methane and carbon intensive, right? It's just that it's dwarfed compared to what synthetics are doing, but it's not negligible. And well, specifically for wool industry, I can tell you that the biggest kind of animal welfare issue that you might have heard about as mulesing. And it's a practice, it's a pretty painful and very intrusive surgical operation that actually is only performed in Australia because they have a parasite that causes a disease in sheep that burrs itself. It's a fly strike, so it burrs itself in the backside of the sheep, causes them a lot of trouble. So there's this violent intervention that removes some of the tissue around the sheep's butts to keep it clean, but it's performed without anesthetic, horrible. So you see now any kind of good retailer would have like mulesing free, for example, labels. A good certification to look out for is responsible wool standard, responsible alpaca standard. It's actually a product of this organization, Textile Exchange. They're like the global certifier of any type of fiber. But I would also say that mulesing has done a big PR problem for wool in general because it's performed only in Australia, but it's like something that people are so aware of and ask questions. But in Canada, we just never had this disease, so we don't perform mulesing on any sheep. Even other big wool producing countries like New Zealand has banned it a long time ago. South Africa never practiced mulesing, so it's like it's nuanced, but it's a big thing. And of course, like beyond animal welfare, like overgrazing and methane, because like beef, sheep are ruminants, so methane emissions are important. But with longevity of the garments, we keep them for longer, and again, you really just don't buy as much. That's, I think, where that sweet spot is. And yeah, thanks for your comments, and thanks everyone for their questions so far. I don't know if we still have time.
We're almost out of time. Did anyone have another question? All right, so we're going to thank Lydia Beida for coming. Excellent talk. I'm very happy. Thank you.